Hello, my name is Justin Rempel. Welcome to part one of looking at poetic devices. Poetic devices are all the different techniques and tools that we can use to build poetry. And it can be pretty intimidating and overwhelming to come in not knowing a whole lot about poetry and be exposed to all these different techniques and devices. So I want to start breaking them down for you. Hopefully you'll have a bit of a better understanding of them by the time we're done. In part one, we're going to focus on the basic building blocks. So these are the real basics that help us get started with understanding poetry. Words. Words are the main device that we use to build poetry. Take a look at these definitions of poetry from a couple great poets. Edgar Allan Poe says, "I would define, in brief, the poetry of words as the rhythmical creation of beauty." So putting words together in beautiful ways. Robert Frost thinks poetry is when an emotion has found its thought and the thought has found words. We're taking our thoughts and we're putting them into word form using all these different techniques. There are many different definitions of poetry, but these are a couple of my favorites. Lines. All poetry is made up of lines of text, which is another word for words. So once we have our words, we have to figure out what kind of lines we want to put them in, how long or short the lines are, how many lines there are, where we put the spaces and the breaks, and a couple different main types of poetry. Metered poetry is where lines have to be a really particular length. Depending on what kind of meter it is, the line has to be a certain number of syllables. So it's a kind of poetry with a lot of rules. But that's where you get really good rhythm and rhyme in the poetry, is when you have a tight meter on it. Free verse is the other kind of poetry. And in free verse, the lines are however long or short the poet wants them to be. It's an artistic choice. And most modern poetry is free verse. And it's easier to make. So if you're a starter poet, I would definitely suggest starting with free verse before you try taking a stab at meter. Different line lengths in free verse can create different effects. So the poet's going to choose different types of lines based on what they're wanting to write about and communicate and what they want the reader to feel. Whether the line is long or short, whether your sentence ends at the end of the line, or maybe the line ends right in the middle of the sentence. Maybe your lines are all the same length, maybe they're different lengths. These all create different effects and different feelings for the reader. So when you're creating your lines of poetry, think about how do these lines make the reader feel. Meter is a really important device in poetry. It's a way of measuring the rhythm. So another way of thinking about it is as a pattern of syllables. If poetry has a meter, we call it metered poetry. And not all metered poetry has a rhyme, but sometimes it does. And usually rhymed poetry is metered. That's where we get those really nice rhythms. If it's unmetered poetry, we call it free verse. So if we do have metered poetry, we measure it in feet. That's our basic unit of measurement. So we measure weight in pounds or kilograms. We measure length in feet or centimeters. Meter in poetry, we measure in feet. There are different kinds of feet depending on how many syllables they have. And which syllable is stressed or emphasized. Most feet are 2 to 3 syllables long, and you can have several different feet in the same line. So in metered poetry, lines are named for how many feet they have. So if a line of poetry only has 1 foot in it, we would call that monometer. If it's got 2 feet, that's called dimeter. 3 feet is called trimeter. 4 feet is tetrameter. 5 feet is pentameter. 6 feet is hexameter, and 7 feet is heptameter. You could get longer lines, but it's very rare to have lines longer than that because those are already really, really long lines of poetry. And you can't fit much more than that on a page. Stanzas. A stanza is a group of lines in a poem with at least one line break before and after. So it's kind of like a paragraph in a book. A good way to think about it that I like to use is it's like a verse in a song, right? Song lyrics are poetry, and they're divided into stanzas called verses. So why would we do this? Why would we split poetry into different stanzas and have breaks in between? Well, a stanza really represents one complete thought, and the line break, the gap in between each stanza, represents a bit of a pause that we take. Here's a good example. I want to fly across the sky. Oh, how absurd to be a bird. So here you can see we've got 2 stanzas, and we can tell that because there's a line in between that's blank. That's what we call the line break. Okay. There are different types of stanzas. So the example we saw on the last slide was called a couplet because each stanza only had 2 lines. If a stanza has 3 lines, we call it a tercet. And if it has 4 lines, we call it a quatrain. You can have stanzas that are 1 line. You can have stanzas that are more than 4 lines. But those are some common terms you might come across. If you're wondering what they mean, it just refers to how many lines are in the stanza. Another term you might hear is refrain. A refrain is a stanza that is repeated throughout a poem. If we find it in a song, we often call it a chorus. So it's exactly the same stanza or very similar to the same stanza, and it's repeated. You find it several times throughout the poem.